January 1873, the Minnesota River Valley. The air did not move. It was a solid thing, a block of cold quartz pressed against the land. It was 42 degrees below zero by the small thermometer Lars Thorsen had nailed to a poplar log, a temperature so severe it made the wood of his new cabin sing in a high, brittle soprano. Inside, the world was divided into two stark, warring territories. The first was the 3-foot circle around the new cast-iron Settler's Pride stove, a circle of scorching metallic heat that burned the skin and dried the eyes. The second territory was everything else in the 12-by-16 room, a realm of absolute creeping frost. Lars Thorsen, a Norwegian carpenter who had arrived 6 months prior, stood in the cold territory, his breath pluming in front of his face, and watched his wife, Ilara, try to nurse their infant son, Anders. She was wrapped in 2 wool blankets, and her shoulders still shook. Lars could see the rime of ice that had formed on the cabin wall just 6 inches behind her head, a delicate crystalline pattern growing inward from the chinking. This was their first winter, and it was going to kill them. He had built this cabin fast, the American way, just as his neighbors had advised. He had bought the stove in St. Paul, a marvel of modern thin-walled iron, guaranteed to heat a room in minutes. This, Lars had discovered, was cruelly true. It heated the air in the room, which then fled instantly through the roof slats and wall cracks, demanding another log and then another. The stove was not a heart, it was a mouth, a hungry, roaring mouth that turned his precious hard-won oak and ash into a brief, violent fever. He would feed it until it glowed a dull, menacing cherry red, the metal ticking and groaning. He and Ilara would be forced to move their chairs back, sweating, only to wake 2 hours later to a silent, frigid room, the child coughing, the stove a cold lump of iron, and the frost advancing once more from the corners. This was not warmth. This was a pendulum, swinging between roasting and freezing, and it was exhausting them. Lars looked at the stove, a machine that cost him more than his tools, and felt a cold, deep resentment. In his homeland, in the mountains above Telemark, he had never been this cold. His grandfather's house, a draughty structure 100 years old, had felt warmer than this. He rubbed his pocket, feeling the small, smooth shape of a soapstone whale his grandfather had carved. As a boy, he'd place it on the cabin base, and it would stay warm in his pocket for hours. He touched the iron stove's side. It was already cooling. He looked at the wall, where the frozen breath of his family was sealing them into a coffin of their own making. He knew with a certainty that chilled him more than the air that the American stove was a lie, and if he did not find a truth, Anders would not see the spring. That previous summer, in the long, hopeful light of June 1872, Lars Thorsen had been proud of his progress. He had his land, a good stand of timber, and the advice of Silas Croft, a man from Ohio who had been in the valley for 3 years and considered himself a veteran. "You're thinking too slow, Lars," Silas had said, spitting tobacco juice onto a stump. "This ain't Norway. We build fast here. Winter don't wait." Silas had shown him the American method, felling the logs, skidding them, and saddle-notching the corners. It was quick, and it was sloppy. The chinking, Silas advised, was just mud and grass. "Slap it in, get a roof on, and get your stove," he'd said. "That's the trick. The stove does the work." Lars, wanting to be a good neighbor, wanting to prove himself in this new land, had suppressed the unease in his gut. He knew chinking. He knew the value of dried moss, collected over weeks, mixed with clay and horsehair, worked until it was a perfect pliable seal. But there was no time. He used the mud and grass. He bought the settler's pride. It was a black, spindly-legged thing, and the man at the mercantile in St. Paul had slapped its side. "This is the king, mister. Best stove in the territory. You'll be warm as toast." Now, in the brutal clarity of January, that work was revealed as a tyranny. The stove demanded everything. Lars spent 8 hours a day in cold that froze the sweat to his beard and made the axe handle burn his palms, just to feed it for 24. He was cutting and splitting green poplar and soft maple because his good dry oak was already gone. The wood hissed and popped, giving little heat and much smoke. The cabin was a cage of his own making. The mud and grass chinking had dried, cracked and fallen out in chunks. He could lie on his bunk and see stars through the wall. The stove, in its inefficiency, created a powerful draught, sucking the 40 below air through every one of those failures, pulling it across the floor. The floor itself was a sheet of ice. Elara kept their bread wrapped in a blanket, but the loaf was always frozen solid. They were living in a wind tunnel, clustered around a small metal volcano. The child's cough was worse. It was a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the tiny, frigid cabin. Elara looked at him, her eyes wide in the dim light of the grease lamp. "Lars," she whispered, "we need more wood." He had just come inside. His fingers were so numb he could not unbutton his own coat. He looked at the wood box, which he had filled to bursting an hour ago. It was nearly empty. He felt a surge of failure so profound it was almost like drowning. He had built this, just as he was told. He had followed the wisdom of this new land, and the wisdom was wrong. It was fast, it was modern, and it was a death sentence. In late February, the cold broke just enough for Lars to risk a trip. He loaded his sledge with the few furs he'd managed to trap and headed for a small, unnamed trading post 20 miles upriver, one he'd been told was run by an old Finn. He was desperate, intending to trade his traps, his spare axe, even his wedding ring, if Elara would let him, for a different stove, a bigger one, anything. He arrived after a 2-day trek, his face a mask of frost. The post was a low, rambling structure, half dug into a hillside, barely visible under the drift. He pushed open the heavy door and stopped. The air inside was gentle. It was not hot, it was not cold, it was warm. It was a soft, even silent warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. The air smelled of tobacco, coffee, and dry cedar. There was no fire roaring. In the corner sat a man Lars assumed was the Finn, Kjetil, smoking a pipe and reading a battered book. He was in his shirt sleeves. "Panka ovikini," Kjetil grunted, not looking up. "Close the door. You are letting the cold in." Lars, bewildered, did so. He looked for the stove. There was none. In the center of the large room stood a monster. It was a massive cube of stone and plastered clay, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet high, with a lower bench extending from one side. It was white, plastered smooth, and warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm, like a living thing. "What is this?" Lars asked, walking toward it, shedding his coat. Kjetil finally looked up. He was older than Lars had thought, with eyes like chips of blue ice. "It is a stove," he said in heavily accented English. "You have never seen a stove?" "Not like this," Lars said. "My stove. It burns all day and I am freezing. Where is your fire?" Kjetil tapped his pipe on the stone. "The fire is gone. I burned it at 4 this morning, for 2 hours. It will be warm in here until tomorrow." Lars touched the stone. It was a deep, radiant, welcoming heat. "How?" Kjetil sighed, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "Your stove," he said, gesturing to the door. "It is an American stove. It burns wood to heat the air. The air runs away. It is stupid. This," he slapped the plaster, "is a mass oven. A mass oven. I burn the wood to heat the stone. The stone does not run away. It holds the heat. It lets it go slow. You understand?" He took a piece of charcoal and drew on the floor. "The fire is here." He drew a box. "The smoke does not go up. It goes down, then across, then up, then across again, then out. The smoke walks a long, long way before it can sleep. By the time it leaves the chimney, it is tired. It is cold. It has given all its warmth to the stone." Lars stared at the drawing, a complex, winding S shape, a counterflow flue. He thought of his grandfather's kamin, with its thick walls. He thought of the soapstone whale in his pocket. "It's a heat trap," Lars whispered, the Norwegian word varmebattery, a heat battery forming in his mind. "Ja," Kjetil said, "a battery. You build a fast house, you buy a fast stove, and you spend your whole life running, a slave to the wood. Or you build one time, slow, and you rest. Your choice." Lars Thorsen bought no stove that day. He traded his furs for flour, salt, and fire clay. He spent 2 days with Kjetil, sketching, measuring, and learning. He returned home not with a new stove, but with an idea that felt as old as the mountains he'd left. That spring, the moment the ground thawed, Lars Thorsen began. His neighbors, busy with their plows, thought he was mad. He was not planting his full crop. He was not repairing his fences. He was on the riverbank with his sledge, digging. He was testing the clay, mixing it with sand, feeling the texture, letting it dry in his palm. He was looking for a specific plastic consistency, the kind that would fire hard and not crack. He found it in a deep cutbank, a rich blue-grey deposit. He spent 3 weeks hauling it, load by load. Ilara, seeing the fire in his eyes, did not question him. She helped. They piled the clay near the cabin, covering it with wet canvas. Then he turned to the fields. He was not ploughing, he was gathering stone. His land was rich in glacial till, the rounded, hard-headed granite and basalt stones that his neighbors cursed and threw to the fence lines. Lars welcomed them. He chose them like a man choosing apples, looking for size, for flatness, for weight. He needed mass. He needed hundreds of pounds of it. Silas Croft rode by one afternoon, seeing Lars struggling with a massive boulder on his stone boat. "Thorsen, that's a fool's game. You'll break your back for a rock. Leave it for the frost to heave." Lars just wiped the sweat from his eyes. "It is for the stove, Silas." "Stove? What stove needs a rock like that?" "This one will," Lars said. His obsession was total. He spent the nights by lamplight, redrawing Kjetil's design, adapting it for his own smaller cabin. The stove would be the new center of the home. It would have to be. He calculated the weight. It would be thousands of pounds. His existing floor would never hold it. He would have to build a foundation, a pier coming up from the earth itself. He traded his spare keg of nails to a blacksmith for a small load of firebrick, the precious kiln-fired blocks that could withstand the direct inferno of the firebox. He would use them only for the Ildstead, the fire's heart. Everything else would be stone, clay, and sand. He explained it to Ilara one night, sketching on the floorboards. "The fire will burn here as hot as we can make it. The smoke will be forced down this channel, then travel under a bench here." he pointed, "where we can sit. Then it will go up the main mass across the top, and then out the chimney. By the time it leaves, it will have touched every part of the stove. It's so big, Lars," she said, her voice small. "It will take half the room." "It is the room," he said, touching her face. "It will be the heart. No more cold, no more running for wood. We will burn it once, and we will sleep." The day he began, he took a pickaxe and shattered the floorboards in the center of their home. He began to dig a 3-foot-deep hole inside his own cabin. Silas, visiting, just shook his head and left, convinced the Norwegian had finally lost his mind to the winter. The construction consumed his summer. He dug the foundation pit down to the hard-pan clay, filled it with packed gravel, and then laid the largest, flattest stones as a base. This was the anchor, the point from which all the mass would rise, separate from the cabin's own floor. He built the firebox with his precious firebricks, his hands on, carpenter's eye ensuring every joint was perfect, sealed with a thin slurry of fire clay. This was the engine. Then came the channels, the intricate winding path for the smoke. This was the secret, and it was agonizingly slow work. He used flat stones, mortared with his river clay and sand mix, building a labyrinth inside the growing stone box. He had to ensure it was perfectly sealed, so no smoke would escape into the room, and perfectly sized, so the draft would draw. He'd lie awake at night, visualizing the flow of hot gas, a river of energy he was attempting to dam. "It must be tight," he muttered, his hands caked in dried clay. "The smoke must work." Around this core he built the mass, stone by stone, mixed with a thick, heavy mortar of clay, sand and straw. The stove grew. It was not masonry, it was sculpture. Ilara and young Anders, now walking, helped mix the cob, their feet sinking into the mud pit outside. The cabin was a mess of clay, stone, and wet straw. Neighbors stayed away, whispering. The stove rose to his chest, then his shoulders. He built a thick stone bench into one side, the channel for the smoke passing directly beneath its surface. "This will be your seat," he told Ilara, "the warmest seat in Minnesota." Finally, he built the outer skin, a thick layer of fieldstone, and plastered the entire contraption with a final, smooth coat of pale clay mixed with lime wash he'd made from burned mussel shells. It stood in the center of their home like a prehistoric altar, white and silent, 8 feet long, 7 feet high. It took 2 weeks to cure, building tiny, whisper fires of twigs, just enough to warm the stone, to dry the thousands of pounds of water locked in the clay. The cabin was cold and damp as the curing fires burned. Silas Croft's warnings echoed in his ears. What if it didn't draw? What if it cracked? What if, after all this, it failed? By late October, as the first probing frosts returned, it was done. The clay was dry, the stove was silent, it waited. The test came on a Sunday in early December. A white wind blew down from the north, a true blizzard that promised to be the equal of the one that had nearly broken them. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in 12 hours. By nightfall, the wind was a solid, screaming wall of sound, and the snow was a horizontal blur. Silas Croft and his family, terrified their own stovepipe would fail in the wind, had come to the Thorson cabin, expecting to huddle in misery. Silas looked at the massive, cold, white stove with pity. "Well, Lars," he said, his voice tight with anxiety, "let's hope that old iron settler's pride you got in the corner still works." Lars shook his head. He had sold the iron stove for seed. "We will use this one," he said. His hands, he was ashamed to admit, were shaking. He went to his woodpile, a small, carefully curated stack of dry oak, and loaded the firebox. He took more wood than he had ever dared burn at one time in the old stove, packing the box tight. Ilara looked at him, her hand to her mouth. With Silas and his family watching, Lars lit a twist of paper and pushed it into the firebox. He opened the flue. The draught took. The fire did not just burn, it ignited. With the mass of the stove still cold, the draught was immense. The fire roared like a furnace, a white-hot inferno that scared Silas's children. It was a terrifying, violent sound. Lars let it burn, adding wood, keeping the firebox full, and the fire roaring at its absolute peak. He was not trying to heat the room, he was trying to charge the battery. For 2 solid hours the fire raged, consuming as much wood as the old stove would have used in a full day. The outside of the stove remained cool. Silas looked pale. "Lars, it's just going up the chimney. All the heat. It's not working." "It is working," Lars said, his eyes on the fire. Then, when the wood had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of white-hot coals, he did the unthinkable. He closed the main flue damper. A heavy iron plate he'd built deep inside. He sealed the firebox. The fire, starved of air, went out. The roaring stopped. The cabin was plunged into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the shriek of the blizzard outside. "Lars, you've put it out!" Silas yelled. "Are you mad? We'll freeze." "Wait," Lars said. He put his hand on the plaster. It was still cool. The first hour was agonizing. The cabin grew cold. Silas's wife began to cry. Lars sat on his stool, refusing to move, his face a mask of stone. Then Ilara, who was sitting on the stone bench, spoke. "Lars," she whispered, "the bench. It's warm." Lars touched the plaster. It was no longer cool. A gentle, faint warmth was breathing from it. By the third hour, the entire 8-foot mass was radiating a steady, gentle heat. It was not the scorching, dry heat of the iron stove. It was a deep, pervasive warmth, like the sun on a spring day. The blizzard screamed, but inside the cabin, the frost on the walls began to melt. By the 5th hour, the cabin was 70 degrees. Silas took off his coat. His children, who had been huddled and shivering, uncurled and fell asleep on the floor. The stove was silent. The next morning the blizzard still raged. The cabin was warm. Lars had not added a single stick of wood. The stove was still pumping out heat. Silas Croft sat in his shirt sleeves, staring at the white stone. It's still warm," he said in disbelief. They stayed for 2 full days. The blizzard buried the cabin in a 10-foot drift, and in all that time, Lars Thorsen did not add one more piece of wood. The stove, fed by that single 2-hour charge, heated his family and his neighbors for 48 hours straight. When the storm broke, Silas Croft did not go home. He stood by the stove, touching it, feeling the last of the warmth still radiating from its core. "You must show me," he said. And Lars, who had been the student, became the teacher. That spring, Silas built his own, with Lars supervising. It was not as elegant, but it worked. The news spread by word of mouth, a quiet revolution against the tyranny of the iron stove. Settlers, who had accepted that winter meant a life of cold misery and endless labor, came to the Thorsen cabin. They came to sit on the warm bench, to feel the silent, steady heat. They came to learn. Lars Thorsen, the quiet Norwegian, became an unlikely authority. He taught them how to find the clay, how to mix the mortar, how to build the S-flue. He gave his knowledge away freely. The Thorsen stove, as it came to be known, began to appear in the valleys. German families recognized the principle of their Kachelofen, Russians, their Pech. Lars had not invented it, he had simply remembered it. He had remembered that the solution to an extreme environment was not a quick fix. The stove's legacy was written in the region's survival. During the long winter of 1880, when the territory was cut off for months, families with Thorsen stoves survived. They burned railroad ties, they burned furniture, but they burned it efficiently, getting every last calorie of heat, storing it in the mass. Families with iron stoves, their wood piles gone, froze. The stove changed the economy of life. Men were no longer wood slaves, spending half their lives feeding a hungry mouth. They could work, they could rest, they could repair tools. Women were not confined to a 3-foot circle of heat. The entire home became livable. Children like Anders grew up without the constant hacking cough of a drafty, cold cabin. The innovation, born of one man's desperation, became the region's shared wisdom. What Lars Thorsen had built was a machine of profound engineering intelligence. His American neighbors, with their settler's pride, were using a system that was perhaps 20% efficient. 80% of their wood's heat and their life's labor went straight up the chimney. The iron stove was a simple radiator. Lars's masonry heater was a sophisticated contraflow heat exchanger. By forcing the hot exhaust gas, often over 1,000 degrees, through a long, winding, 20-foot channel, he slowed its journey. He forced the gas to give up its energy to the hundreds of pounds of stone. The gas that finally left the chimney was barely 200 degrees. It had been harvested. That single 2-hour white-hot burn was the other secret. It achieved secondary combustion, burning the wood gases and creosote that merely caked the inside of a slow-burn iron stove. It was cleaner, safer, and radically more efficient. He didn't have the words thermal mass or heat exchanger, but he knew the principle. He knew it from the granite cliffs of his homeland, which held the sun's heat long into the night. He knew it from the small soapstone whale in his pocket. He had simply built a small mountain inside his house and taught it how to hold a fire. This was the same principle that modern engineers would use in rocket stoves, in passive solar design, in resilient, low-energy housing. It was the ancient wisdom that efficiency is not about speed, but about retention. He had built a battery for warmth, and in doing so, had liberated his family from the fear of winter. Lars Thorsen lived to be an old man. He saw the railroad come, and he saw his valley fill with towns. He saw his son, Anders, build his own farmhouse, and the first thing Anders built, in the center of the new foundation, was a massive massoven. Lars sat by his stove, now stained and scarred from 40 years of use, his hands gnarled by work. He would hold the small, smooth soapstone whale, place it on the warm plaster, and feel the two heats merge. The stove had outlived Silas. It had outlived the settler's pride. It had outlived the era of the frontier. It remained a silent, warm testament in the center of the home. It was the physical manifestation of a profound lesson. The world was full of quick fixes, and of thin iron stoves that promised immediate heat but demanded constant servitude. They were the solutions of impatience. They burned the wood, but they consumed the man. True resilience, Lars understood, was built slowly. It was built with mass. It required an investment of labor and foresight that the impatient world called madness. He had built his stove with the same slowness with which it released its heat. He had learned that in the face of an extreme and unforgiving world, the only true security was to build a reservoir. You build a battery. You store the harvest, you store the water, and you store the fire. Preparation is not just an act, it is a structure. And the heaviest stones, the ones that take the most effort to move, are the only ones that can hold the warmth through the long, dark night.